All right, guys, today we are continuing our offseason content with another installment of our buy low, sell high series, following up on our video that we posted last week, continuing the conversation around the tight ends. But today, looking at the flip side of the coin, tight ends that I feel are improperly valued in the market, that are overly valued based on maybe their situation, the team that they're in, or some other factor like draft capital. And I think that you should be avoiding because they're not going to help you bring home a fantasy championship in 2023. So as always, like the video, comment down below what you think of the list I have here today for you. Subscribe to the channel if you are new, and I'll see you on the other side of that intro. Welcome back into Twin Takes Fantasy Football. Today we're talking about way overvalued tight ends, and tight ends, especially outside of tight end premium leagues, are a hotly debated position for fantasy. There's a few people that contend that in order to win, you need to take advantage of that positional scarcity and the positional advantage of a top tier tight end like a Travis Kelce or a Mark Andrews. And then once you get outside of those top few people or top few tight ends, the production, just because of how limited the tight end position is for fantasy production, that you can punt the position all the way down to 13th, 14th, 15th rounds of drafts and get the same production for a much cheaper price. So no matter what your opinion is on tight ends, we're going to talk about the full gamut. We have 5 tight ends here today we're going to talk about that go all the way from the top 3 tight end that I think is really overvalued, all the way to some sleepers that I'm going to try to poke some holes in and think that you should maybe pivot elsewhere instead of wasting a slightly overvalued pick on a quote-unquote breakout sleeper at the tight end position. So without further ado, let's get into our list. First one, we're going to start off with a banger, a top 3 tight end that's pretty consensus, and that's going to be TJ Hawkinson of the Minnesota Vikings. I know in Dynasty leagues, he's pretty consensus valued as a tight end number 3 in Dynasty, and I just really can't fathom that. First off, I always love to say follow the money, and he was shipped off to Detroit because they were never going to give him that tight end 1 money. They're not going to give him the contracts that a George Kittle, a Darren Waller, a Mark Andrews, or a Travis Kelce received. They just didn't feel that was his value. And if NFL teams don't feel it's his value, then maybe we should stop valuing him the same way in fantasy as well. Also, it was perceived that he was going to get that big contract extension upon his arrival in Minnesota, and that still hasn't happened. The contract talks, even this far into the offseason, have still not really made much progress. And that's very concerning, again, when you want to follow the money. But I just think he's way overvalued given the disappointing few years he's had as a tight end. I think people are still grasping onto the fact that he had top 10 draft capital when the Detroit picked him out of Iowa about 4 or 5 years ago at this point. And he's had moments of brilliance. Don't get me wrong. He's had those blow up games where he's had multiple touchdowns, where he's been a difference maker at the tight end position, but it's just never been consistent. He'll have a moment of brilliance 1 week and then he'll just completely disappear the next week. And overall, just based on where he's been drafted as far as ADP concerns, he's most of the time, except for last year, been a disappointment at the tight end position. And no one obviously predicted him going to this favorable situation that was the Minnesota Vikings. Now, with that favorable situation in mind, he's going to be overvalued once again this offseason. Another big concerning fact is, you look at guys that have a more safe quarterback situation, like a Dallas Goedert that I mentioned last week. TJ Hawkinson, he got a ton of production because of his connection with Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins really utilized TJ Hawkinson down the stretch after he was traded to Minnesota. And the issue with that is that the Minnesota Vikings have been pretty clear that Kirk Cousins is going to be let go from the team after this year. They have made no effort to extend his contract past this year, and they are pretty clear in moving on from him once the 2023 season wraps up. And even more concerning, they don't have a next guy up to take over at the quarterback position. They're either going to have to go out and draft a rookie next year or sign a free agent veteran, both of which bring a lot of controversy and questions to the quarterback position. And I just think overall, having that shakeup at a very vital position in the Minnesota offense is going to be a downgrade for TJ Hawkinson after this year. Like I said last week, a lot of these concerns I've brought up already makes me kind of question why he's at tight end 3. I just don't think that he has a consistency of the other tight ends. Obviously has a lot of questions around his situation. And I think also with some of the players they added this offseason, Jordan Addison coming into the fold is really going to eat into a lot of Hawkinson's production. We saw Hawkinson, just his targets skyrocketed because outside of Justin Jefferson, there really was no pass catching threat on the Minnesota Vikings offense. Adam Thielen, his production severely declined. KJ Osborne nor Kendrick Bourne really stepped up to take over as the wide receiver too. So we just saw Justin Jefferson getting doubled on every single play, and that forced Kirk Cousins to just hyper target TJ Hawkinson. With Addison coming in, I think he's a great wide receiver. Anyone who follows this channel knows I am a big proponent of Jordan Addison and the production he brings. I think he's going to have he's going to command tremendous respect across from Justin Jefferson, as well as soak up a lot of the targets that TJ Hawkinson was getting. So I don't think he'll be as utilized in the offense as he was in the second half of last year. So with all those things in consideration, him as a tight end 3 is a little unfathomable to me. I would try to be trading him for, a Dallas Goedert, a guy that I like a lot more, that has a lot more stable situation. I think he's going to have a lot more opportunity. So if you have TJ Hawkinson, definitely trying to flip him for a Dallas Goedert plus, or maybe a lower tier tight end plus, if that's the way other people in your league value him as a tight end 3 in Dynasty, because I just think it's going to be a rocky road for him going forward. Moving on, I know I'm going to get some flack for this one, but this is a sleeper that I just can't really understand why people are drafting him so high. These numbers I don't believe are correct as his current draft position, because I know people are going just a little bit crazy on the Greg Dulcich hype after he had an average year last year. But if we think back to the offseason of 2022, there was a Broncos tight end who was getting a ton of hype, who was being drafted in the top around like round 9, round 8 in redraft leagues, and just completely predicted to be breaking out. There's so much hype around this guy named Russell Wilson coming into the offense, and just absolutely going to use this freak athlete of a tight end. And where's Albert Okwuegbunam now? Yeah, mostly drops it on the waiver wires, even in dynasty leagues. He's completely irrelevant going forward. So I believe Greg Dulcich is getting the same artificial hype that Albert O happened, and we saw what happened to Albert Okwuegbunam last year. Don't fall into that same trap with Greg Dulcich. Obviously, there's a lot of hype around the Broncos with Sean Payton coming in, but I think there was so much more problem than just an ineffective offensive-minded head coach in Nathaniel Hackett. For all the problems the Broncos had, it could not be attributed to one single factor. There's other issues going on, most of which revolves around the quarterback and Russell Wilson. And I think, it's really not a logical move to really bet on the comeback of Russell Wilson, especially after the abysmal year he put up last year. So, you're getting a lot of hype around the Broncos pieces. Because of the Sean Payton effect, I would recommend using that hype and that bump in value to sell right now before the season comes crashing down. Also, speaking of Russell Wilson, he's just a guy that historically has not really utilized the tight end position, just doesn't really throw there. Whether it's a height concern or whether it's just, the way he does his progressions through routes, just to, never really a facet of his game, whether it was last year or or in Seattle. So I think, guys that are much cheaper, like a Dalton Schultz, like a Hayden Hurst, are going to give you the same production that Greg Dulcich will get. It's just so many mouths to feed that I don't think that Greg Dulcich is even going to warrant the volume to be a sustainable tight end. Yes, he might get some touchdown upside in the end zone, but I can't fathom him getting, the target share of 60 to 70 to 80 targets to make him worthwhile as a tight end being, a sleeper candidate. You have Cortland Sutton, Jerry Jeudy, KJ Hamler, Tim Patrick still in the team. They drafted Marvin Mims. You have Javonte Williams. You're bringing in Samaje Perine as a pass catching back. There are just so many offensive mouths to feed that I just don't think the volume is going to be there for Greg Dulcich to really make an impact. So let all the other super analysts, all the data-centric guys, all the statistical nuanced wonders in your leagues, take Greg Dulcich, because I promise you it's not going to work out. Moving on to our third tight end, we're going to go with a guy who's a little bit older. It's going to be Darren Waller. Listen, I understand he's been a fantastic tight end in the past, but he's definitely a guy that I'm really, really concerned about heading into 2023. Obviously, he is on the wrong side of 30 now. That big 3 right in front of his age number here, that's not good. So we're expecting to see the cliff of Darren Waller come much sooner rather than later. He's on a new team, and historically, if you look at tight ends who, top end tight ends transitioning to a new team, it just never really pays off. Obviously, we've had similar examples of top 10 tight ends in the past history, whether it's Austin Hooper is the first one that comes to mind now. Obviously not as big name as Darren Waller, but if we extrapolate that over the past 10 years or so, it's just never historically worked out for tight ends, especially given Darren Waller's age, making an impact from a fantasy standpoint on their new team. First off, and secondly, this is a guy that, we remember 3 years ago how dominant he was, how he was a championship winner for your fantasy leagues, but he's significantly struggled with injuries before and since then. And I don't think that as he increases up in age, his injury propensity is going to get any easier. So yeah, I am very concerned about the injury status of Darren Waller. I just can't fathom a reality in which he plays the entirety of the season, maybe even half a season. So we're also attached to a quarterback in Daniel Jones, who I just don't think is he's a competent game manager, but I just don't think he's going to take that next step as a passer, especially with some of the offensive weapons they've brought in Wan'Dale Robinson. Obviously, Saquon Barkley, despite not signing his contract yet, he's still a great pass catcher. But Daniel Jones just really doesn't throw the football that much. He is much more for his unathletic appearance. He actually does scramble and run the ball quite well. He does vulture a lot of those TDs inside the 5-yard lines when he takes off and scrambles. And obviously last year, he had a great season, but it never really panned out for any of his pass catching weapons. So yes, right now with Darren Waller, you look at him, you see, hey, listen, he's going to a place that was super tight end needy. It's a great situation. He has Brian Dable, an offensive guru, a head coach. You have that name value of a Darren Waller, but make sure you try to recoup that value. Listen, if someone's going to give you a second round pick, a 2024 second round pick, I think the 2024 draft is going to be really, really valuable. So I would definitely be accepting that kind of draft capital. I'd even throw in a fourth to get it done. But yeah, I think Darren Waller, I think his time is come and gone, and it's time to capitalize on that name value and try to make your team a little bit younger. Moving on to another breakout guy that towards the end of the season last year, people were getting very, very high on him. So where is he? There we go. Tight end for the Arizona Cardinals in Trey McBride. First off, let's just look at this logo right here. Does this inspire confidence in any sort of fashion, football or fantasy football right now? I don't think so. This is an organization that's in complete ruin and an insane amount of turmoil. It's so dysfunctional right now that's hard for me to buy in to any Arizona Cardinals facet. I mean, obviously I've talked about James Conner, but running back agnostic, especially some of the younger pieces on this offense. I'm not really willing to make that huge investment in Dynasty, especially because you're paying a premium on the youth here of a Trey McBride. He only had one productive game last year, and it was the last game of the season. It was obviously bolstered by the 2 touchdowns, and people are extrapolating that game out to saying, oh, that was his breakout game. He's going to continue to give that sort of production, and I don't think that it's really a smart idea to extrapolate all that data from just one singular game, especially it's a game that came from an offensive system that's no longer in Arizona right now. It was under the old Texas Tech head coach. Can't remember his name right now, but he's now since departed from the Arizona Cardinals, along with a lot of the offensive coaching staff. Jonathan Gannon has come in and brought in an entirely new offensive coaching staff, and they don't have any loyalty to Trey McBride. He might not be their guy going forward. Also, you have Zach Ertz, who is on missed the second half of last season with that ACL tear, but he's going to be back. I mean, they paid him a lot of money to be the tight end 1 of the Arizona Cardinals. And I think even with DeAndre Hopkins being shipped off, he's still going to be the prime target from the tight end position. And Zach Ertz is going to vulture a lot of that opportunity, especially in the end zone that Trey McBride saw at the end of last season. So much uncertainty around the organization, an organization that's completely in tear down and rebuild mode. There's obviously a ton of uncertainty around the QB, whether they're going to keep Kyler, whether they're going to bring him back after his ACL, whether they're going to draft Caleb Williams and completely restructure this entire offense. Just for the premium that people are putting on younger players right now in Dynasty, I just can't fathom paying that price for Trey McBride. If someone wants to give you a late second rounder, maybe even like an early projected third rounder for Trey McBride, I think that's worth the investment to move off of him as a tight end. Just not a guy that I'm trying to go out and acquire this current offseason. It's just, this is not the time to acquire. Last guy, and I know his name has been absolutely just dragged through the mud, and, we've talked about him ad nauseum over the past 2 off seasons, ever since he's been drafted number 4 overall by the Atlanta Falcons. But we can't talk about a sell high video without mentioning Kyle Pitts, but I will keep it brief. I do think Kyle Pitts is super talented. I love him as a prospect. I think as a football player, he's great, but the situation he is in is just absolutely abysmal. And I think people are still making that bet on the talent, but talent can only get you so far. I would implore you to go back and look at the video of his targets that he had last year before he was injured. I mean, I would say 75% of them were uncatchable, even for a 6'6" tight end like Kyle Pitts. I mean, just the way Marcus Mariota was slinging the ball around the football field was atrocious and nauseating, to say the least. But if we look at the position now that Arthur Smith is going into his second year as coach and where they're shaping the offense, well, it's going to be around the run game. They drafted Bijan Robinson 8th overall, and even from some of the offseason draft reports, they had brought in Peter Skoronski, the offensive tackle out of Northwestern, and apparently Peter, after the draft, said Arthur Smith was so set. He could tell that he was so set on Bijan Robinson that he looked at Peter and just completely was on his phone the entire time, just gave no sense of mind to Peter Skoronski, just completely uninterested because they knew where they were going. And he's going to build his offense around Bijan Robinson and severely limit the passing opportunity that Kyle Pitts has. And, you know, it may not be completely possible to build an offense entirely around one running back, but they still have Tyler Algier as a great secondary option to Bijan Robinson. He quietly had over 1,000 yards last season and was one of my favorite sleeper running backs in the draft last year. And I mean, yes, Marcus Mariota, we talked about how bad he was as a passer, but Desmond Ridder comes in as a third-round quarterback, and I don't think anything he did over the past 4 games really instilled much confidence in anyone to facilitate an offensive pass game that's going to utilize both Kyle Pitts and Drake London and make them both top 12 fantasy assets. I just think the offensive game is going to be incredibly limited. And if you look at even the production of what Kyle Pitts brought to the field, in Arthur Smith's scheme prior to his injury, it was a lot of blocking. Arthur Smith, for lack of a better word, he's clearly a competent coach. He's gotten to where he is because he's a smart man, but he just doesn't know how to use Kyle Pitts. I think he's so ingrained in establishing the run game and bringing in a tight end that can block. And hopefully maybe Jonnu Smith comes in and helps, take away some of that blocking responsibility from Kyle Pitts, and Kyle Pitts become more of that pass catching weapon. But we saw last year that, he was used, unfortunately, quite a bit in the run game to help bolster Cordell Patterson and Tyler Algier. So I would say for the price you're paying for Kyle Pitts, for the price you're paying on a guy that is just this athletic freak at 6'6", 245 pounds, a guy that was taken number 4th overall in the NFL draft, I think that draft capital still sticks out in people's minds. I think the talent still sticks out in people's minds, and people aren't taking into the realistic situation of the Atlanta Falcons offense that he's in. And just at his price, I think there are guys that, are much, much cheaper that you can realize the same or if not more production when it comes to fantasy football. So, all right, so that's going to wrap up our discussion on tight ends here that I just don't think you should be drafting, or if you're in the Dynasty League, that you should be maximizing their value right now. It's always hard to talk about tight ends because the conversation around them so varied, whether people think that they are a positional advantage or it's just so irrelevant when it comes to fantasy because they are used in non-scoring facets like blocking that, you can just punt the position and only focus on more relevant and more point scoring positions like the running back, wide receiver, or tight end. So hopefully whatever your opinion is on tight ends, I gave you a little bit of clarity today. If you are curious around like some trade offers you've gotten for these guys or want to clear up some value that I think you should be trading them on, please put them in the comments down below. I'll do my best to respond. And this means that we do have one more position to get to. That's going to be quarterback. So we'll do that here soon. But until then, take care, guys.